Well, good morning, everyone. Very happy to see you all this morning, to be here with you. And I pray that everything we do this morning will encourage and instruct each other as we open up God's Word. Our lesson for this morning will come from Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. We're currently in the middle of a series looking at Romans chapter 8, and we're going through this a little bit section by section. And we've gone through two lessons looking at the first 17 verses through the lens of verse 6. Romans chapter 8, verse 6 reads, "For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." And so we're looking at these different aspects of the Spirit that we can set our minds to, because what we set our minds on affects us. It affects how we live. It affects how we think. It affects our dispositions. And so when we set our minds to the Spirit and the things of the Spirit, Paul promises us that we will have what he calls life and peace. That we will have a very active way of living, because Christianity is about life. It's about living in a way that is good, in a way that is right and with God. And we will also have peace, which for the Jews was rooted in a right relationship with God. And it wasn't just merely to be calm, although maybe in some respects it includes that. But it's this idea of my relationship with God is right, and therefore I can withstand anything, because nothing can come between me and God, which Paul himself will summarize Romans 8 with, this idea that nothing can separate us from God. And so when we set our minds to the Spirit and what the Spirit is and the work of the Spirit, that when that is our focus, we will inevitably cultivate life and peace. And so we looked at some things such as freedom, setting our minds to the freedom we have in the Spirit. And this morning we are going to see what it means to be Christians who are waiting and how we wait. And ultimately this morning, I want to focus our attention on the steadfastness that we have in the Spirit. Because Christians are a people who wait. We are a waiting people. We are waiting for Christ's return. And in fact, if we take our Christianity seriously, we understand that we are looking forward to living much more fully than we are even right now. And that this life that we have now, we're just sojourners through. And so we're waiting for the return of our Savior and of our King. We're also waiting, as we read here in verses 18 through 25, for the glorification of creation. That the creation itself, Paul writes, waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And the creation is subjected to futility. And in verse 21, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage. We're waiting for this kind of glorification of creation. And we're also waiting for the glorification of God's children. That is Christians, the church, that the people who will be in heaven, their glorification. we're waiting for this. We're waiting to see it, the glorification of God's children, the redemption, as Paul writes in verse 23, of our bodies. We are waiting for this. And so we are awaiting people, and we're waiting for something we hope in, which is something Paul summarizes in verse 24 and 25 as something that we don't see. He says, for in this hope we were saved, right? This hope of the glorification of creation and the hope of the redemption of our bodies and of God's children. He says, for in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And Paul tells us how to wait. He says with patience. And I think the word steadfast is actually a better word, and I'm going to explain that in just a moment. And so this morning, I'm focusing on the fact that we are awaiting people and that we wait with steadfastness in the Spirit. And when we set our minds on the steadfastness of the Spirit, we cultivate life and peace. So beginning in this section, what I'd like to do is kind of define steadfastness for us to make sure we're all on the same page and we're all thinking about this conceptually the same. If you look in verse 25, what we just read, Paul writes, but if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. If you're reading out the New American Standard, or maybe a different version, it may say that we wait for it with perseverance, or in perseverance we wait for it. And I think a very good definition of biblical steadfastness is patient perseverance. Actually, just taking both of these. And I think it helps us to start wrapping our heads around what New Testament and biblical steadfastness is. It's a kind of patient perseverance. It's really both of these ideas. And patience is going to then be the ability to wait without being agitated. Because waiting is hard. We sometimes get frustrated from having to wait for too long. Especially when we're little, we can hardly wait for anything. And as we get older, we can wait a little bit longer, but it still gets hard. Patience is the ability to wait without being agitated, without being flustered or frustrated. And perseverance is the ability to go forward even when our circumstances make going forward difficult. So you imagine someone who's in a certain set of circumstances where, as we sometimes say, the odds are stacked against them, and they persevere through it. So they're able to go forward even when circumstances seem as if going forward is difficult, if not impossible. And steadfastness is kind of both of these. It's the ability to wait without being agitated while persevering, while going forward. And steadfastness is really a fruit of the Spirit. And we kind of laid the groundwork for what I'm about to say in our class this morning, that steadfastness or patience, being a fruit of the Spirit, means it's something we don't produce ourselves. It's something God produces in our lives. And so we need to understand steadfastness as something that the Spirit produces in us, which is why we set our minds to the steadfastness of the Spirit and not merely my steadfastness and my abilities. And when we begin to think of steadfastness as a fruit of the Spirit and as this kind of patient perseverance, I think we can see how steadfastness is like it's an activity. And that's why I like the word steadfast, because patience in our language sounds very passive. It's something that I just sit through and endure while doing nothing. And that's not really what's going on here. That's why I like when we think about it in terms of patient perseverance, that we don't become agitated as we persevere through difficulties. that we begin to think of it as an activity, as a fruit of the Spirit, just as love is an activity. It's something we do. Self-control is an activity. It's something we do. Patience or steadfastness, which is also a fruit of the Spirit, it's an activity. It's something we do. And it's something that God produces in us. And this is why, as I said, setting our mind on the steadfastness of the Spirit cultivates life and peace, because it's not our steadfastness. It's something God produces in us as we work with God. Now, the reason why Paul focuses on patience, on waiting with patience, or steadfastness, as I'm saying, is because we are a people who are waiting. So you read, for example, in verse 25, if we hope for what we do not see as we do, then we wait for it with patience. Christians are a people who are waiting. And there are good ways of waiting, and there are bad ways of waiting. There's no getting around the fact that we have to wait. That's inescapable. And we can wait by throwing tantrums, as sometimes children do. And that's a way of waiting, but that's how they get through it. Or we can wait by distracting ourselves. Often distracting ourselves with our favorite sins to help us get through this period of waiting. So we have to wait no matter what. But the question is, how do we wait? And this is why setting our minds on the Spirit is so important, because we have to wait. And we set our minds on this steadfastness of the Spirit, because steadfastness is the ability to wait in the right way. Since we have to do it, we must do it in the way God asks of us. And the way to do it is with steadfastness, with patient perseverance. Not becoming so discouraged that Christ hasn't returned yet. Right? Not feeling as if he won't return anytime soon, and so I can start doing whatever I want. This kind of steadfastness, this patient perseverance as we're waiting for the return of Christ, for the glorification of creation, and for the glorification of our bodies. Now, an important context in all of Romans is going to be the issue of suffering. And when you start to get that into the mix, into the context of all of this, I think we can begin to see why steadfastness is so important. Because these are Christians who are really suffering. And so this is important to understand, for example, verse 6, right? To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. This is Paul helping the Christians in Rome to be steadfast in their suffering by telling them what to set their minds to, what to think about, and what to focus on. And this is really the context, you could say, of all of Romans 8, right? That Paul is helping the Christians to set their minds on the Spirit, because Romans 8 is so focused on the Spirit. As we've been reading in verses 1 through 17, the Spirit is going to be this major subject of Romans chapter 8. And so Paul is setting the people's minds on the Spirit to help them endure the suffering that they're in the middle of enduring. Now, in this, I think we have an important principle, which is that the way to endure and have steadfastness through suffering is to set our minds on something outside of the suffering. That's very important. That the way to have steadfastness in suffering is to set our minds on something outside the suffering. If while we're in the middle of suffering, we begin to just dwell on the suffering, or we become discouraged, we become depressed, you become downtrodden, it's very hard to endure suffering when we can't stop thinking about the suffering. And so setting our minds on something outside of suffering is so important for enduring suffering. This reminds me of Job, for example. Job certainly was suffering, and Job was having a difficult time, to say the least. But he kept bringing it back to God. Now, he couldn't make sense of it. He had a very hard time making sense of it. But one thing Job didn't do is he actually didn't do two things. The obvious one is he didn't curse God. But related to that is this, that Job didn't curse his circumstances. Because in many respects, to curse our circumstances is in part to curse God. To curse either what God is directly doing or what God is allowing to happen. And this is one of the reasons why we don't focus on the suffering. You focus on something outside the suffering. I know that throughout this year, many jokes have been made about 2020, how difficult it has been. But if we in our hearts begin to curse our circumstances, I mean, didn't God allow 2020 to happen? Either directly or indirectly? See, to focus on our circumstances rather than something outside of it, it accrues bitterness and resentment. And the way to remain steadfast, the way to wait in the right way, is to focus on something outside the suffering. And this is what Paul has been doing all throughout Romans 8, and especially in the passages we're looking at. He's telling them, set your minds on this glorification of creation. Creation will be it will be set free from its bondage. That's how he puts it. Set your minds on the Spirit. Set your minds on God and on Christ, on this inseparable love, this love that you cannot be separated from. Set your minds on the glorification of your person, of your body, of the children of God who will be revealed for who they are. Set your minds on these things, because these Christians are suffering very deeply. And the way to get through suffering, the way to have steadfastness, is to set our minds on the Spirit and the things of the Spirit, not on the suffering itself. Now, although Christians in Romans are suffering, I don't want to belittle our circumstances or our own suffering. This is something a friend of mine once said to me. He said, if you have two people on the top of the mountain and it's freezing cold and one person's naked and one person has just a shirt, both of them are suffering. Right? The person with the shirt doesn't say, well, I'm not suffering because there's someone worse than me. No, they're both suffering. And just because there are Christians in this world right now, or even in the past, who have suffered worse than us, that doesn't mean we don't suffer. That doesn't mean we don't go through difficulty, especially as Christians. You read about, for example, Peter in his epistle writing about how righteous Lot was tormented in his soul every day at the sins of the city he lived in. And I think that's a kind of suffering. I don't know about you, but there are times where I'm just like, I've got to turn off the TV. I've got to stop watching the news, because I look at the sin around me and I just think, like, how are we going to get through this? And I can't hardly stand it anymore. And to be in a society that is drifting away from God is a kind of suffering. But it's a suffering we are called to be steadfast through. And the way we're steadfast through it is not to focus on all the awful things that are happening, is to focus on something outside of it. To set our minds on the Spirit. To be able to wait for the things we are waiting for in the right way. Because the truth is that there may come a time when even in our own country, we begin to suffer like this. And if we can't endure the little things, how are we supposed to endure the difficult ones? And so Paul here is teaching us how to be steadfast in whatever degree of suffering we may be involved in. This is why I'm saying suffering is such an important aspect of why Paul is writing this, because we set our minds on things outside of the suffering. We set our minds on the Spirit. And in this, there is this steadfastness that we have. Now, I'd like to really start looking into this passage at some of the content here. We've kind of been brushing around it. And I'd like to look, beginning in verses 19 through 23. Paul writes, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." The major theme of this lesson is steadfastness and setting our minds on steadfastness. And we've looked at kind of what steadfastness is, as well as this. Now we are looking at, we are to be steadfast in waiting, you might say. We are to be steadfast as people who are in the position of waiting. And that's what Paul says we are. We are people who are waiting. He says in verse 23, we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. We are in many respects waiting to be revealed for who we really are. And we learn a lot about ourselves by seeing how we wait. You learn a lot about a person in general just by seeing how they wait and whether they can wait. Because waiting in some respects can bring out the worst in us. But we are called to be people who wait with steadfastness to be revealed for exactly who we are. And this is something that is taught already long before you get into the apostles. Jesus himself taught us that we would be waiting. You remember there are all those parables about a master or someone giving someone something, right? Giving someone talents and then going away for a period of time. And in many of Jesus's parables, you have this example of waiting, people who are waiting, Christians who are waiting. And to sign up for Christianity is really to sign up to wait. To wait for Christ's return. To wait for these things we're reading about here. And so we are called to be people who wait in the right way. And that is to wait with this kind of steadfastness. Now, I want to list two things we're waiting for. We've already mentioned it a few times, but I want to dig into it a little more. We're waiting in part for the redemption of creation. So verses 20 through 22, Paul writes, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." It's an odd passage. But Paul gives us this image, really anthropomorphized as a creation, to say that it's waiting eagerly and it's groaning to be redeemed. But you have this image that God made the world, and this world is waiting to be set free. And I think we need to read this in the context also of what Peter writes. You know, Peter writes about how there will be the new heavens and a new earth, and you will have the fires melting all the elements in the heavens and things like that. And I'm afraid that sometimes we get caught up in what Peter writes about what sounds very much like a destruction. And we lose sight of this kind of creation being set free. Let me put it like this. I have encountered people who have had the opinion that, well, it's all going to be destroyed anyway, so what difference does it make? If it's all going to be destroyed, why should I care about how I treat the environment, about how I view creation, what I do to animals? And that's not Paul's view. That's actually not the New Testament view. The New Testament view of heaven is not we go and sit on a cloud for eternity. The view of heaven in the New Testament is a new heaven and a new earth, a new creation, a creation that has been set free from its bondage to corruption, a creation that is waiting eagerly to be revealed for what it is, just as it's waiting for the sons of God to be revealed for who they are. And now, I don't know about you, but this is something I look forward to. This is something I look forward to seeing. What does it mean for creation to be redeemed, to be set free from its bondage to corruption? I mean, I couldn't draw you a picture of that. I don't know what it looks like. But this is what's promised us, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Not that we will sit on a cloud all day, but that we will live in a creation that is better, that is not subject to futility, that is not subject to decay and to death, but something much better than that. And we wait for it. This is one of the reasons why in both the Old Testament and the New Testament you have this frowned upon view of people who prematurely get rid of their inheritance. Right? You think about like Jacob and Esau. Right? He gives up his inheritance for a meal. And in the same way, we often can give up this new creation, this new heaven and this new earth, just for temporary sin. Because we want something good. We want something better than what we have. But Paul tells us to wait for it with patience. Not to prematurely give up our inheritance, but to wait to get the full thing. And the only way to wait for it in the right way is with this steadfastness, this patient perseverance that we get by setting our minds on the Spirit, by setting our minds on things outside of the suffering of this world. So we're steadfast in waiting for the redemption of creation, and we're also steadfast in waiting for the redemption of God's children. So in verse 19, Paul writes that the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And then skipping down to verse 23, he says, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. This is what we're waiting for. We are waiting for everything to be renewed, to be set straight, including us. This redemption of our bodies, to live in this new heaven and this new earth, that we will be revealed as the sons of God, that we will be revealed as being a part of God's family. And I think in both of these, the redemption of creation and the redemption of the person, you actually have two important images of what heaven is. That on one hand, heaven is a place we're going to. The author of Hebrews makes that very clear. It's a land we're going to. And you have this image in the redemption of creation. But in the revealing of the sons of God, you also have an important aspect of heaven, which is that God is there. That's what's so good about heaven. God is there. And we are revealed as God's children. And we are finally a part of God's family who are not, apart from God, but living in God's presence. And we wait eagerly for this. And the way to wait is with steadfastness, with patient perseverance. And Paul here, in writing about this, you see he describes them as two things that really go together. So in verses 19 through 21, when you read it all at once, Paul writes, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." You really see this glorification of the creation and of God's children as inseparable. Try to imagine what it would be to be human not on a planet. Right? Like, who can imagine what that would be like? Like you can't grow food. There's no water. Like you can't imagine it. People are a part of creation. It's inseparable. And you have this same image that in this redeemed creation, in verse 22, that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, that it's groaning because of verse 21, that it wants to obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. That just as you can't imagine what it would be to be human without creation now, you can't imagine the two separated when Christ returns. Because these two things go together, because we are a part of creation. And so Paul writes about these as totally inseparable and in fact waiting on one another. That the creation waits for us as, we're waiting to see, well, what is this going to look like? What is this going to be like? And I think when we start to use our imaginations, what is this new heaven and new earth going to look like? And what am I going to look like with a redeemed body? And what will life be like? When we begin to use our imaginations in this way, we set our minds on something that is far greater than suffering. That is far greater than anything we go through. And that's exactly what Paul says in verse 18. "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." We are a waiting people. And we wait with steadfastness, with patient perseverance. And we are waiting for the glorification of creation. We are waiting for the glorification of God's children. We are waiting for life. And Paul instructs the Christians in Rome, and in doing so, he instructs us to set our minds on these things. In fact, that's what Romans 8 is. It's an exercise in Romans 8, verse 6. To set our minds on the things of the Spirit. And since steadfastness is a fruit of the Spirit, that is what we set our minds to. And so this morning, I encourage you to set your mind on the Spirit, and in doing so, to set your mind on steadfastness, on not giving up, on patient perseverance, to be able to endure the difficulties of this life, and to joyfully look forward to all that is promised to us. If you're here this morning, and if you need help in any way, we ask that you will talk to us, that you'll talk to us if you need prayers. We'll talk to us if you have questions. If you need help in any way, please talk to us, or even come forward now as we'll stand and sing the song of invitation.